I would start by just giving you a sense of what led me to write this book, and then give you a kind of a mini version of what the essence of the book is, and then try to bring that into current circumstances and how, in some ways, it's never been more important than to pay close attention to the developmental realities of the students we still teach. So over the last 25 years or so, I became increasingly disturbed by the rate at which anxiety and depression, but not just those conditions themselves, but the more dangerous manifestations of those things, eating disorders and substance abuse and cutting and self-injury. And for the last decade, more and more suicides have happened in schools like ours around the world. And this gave me, gives everybody pause, but it just made me think something is terribly wrong. And at that time, I had this fantasy that if I could somehow bring all of the students with whom I'd worked in a therapeutic relationship into one large auditorium, and they wouldn't have aged into their now adult age. They'd still be the adolescents they were. I had this fantasy that they would say something like, when are you adults going to get this? When are you going to realize how hard this is? And then I imagined they would say something like, how far do we students have to push this before you begin to change? If you think about it, when any of our students are struggling in any way, we tend to refer them. We do what we think we should do. And it's what I've always thought too. We refer them to psychologists and social workers and psychiatrists and other counselors, and we say, here, take advantage of this service. And we hope the service helps you manage your feelings more effectively. And here, you take these medications and maybe these will help. But we never, ever, ever have looked in the mirror and asked ourselves, what is it that we are doing in schools that has kids so anxious and so depressed and so unsettled in the first place? And it was that question that led me on a research kind of journey. Having studied for a long time with Robert Keegan at Harvard, he's the author of Overcoming the Immunity to Change, among other books. I studied with him for quite a bit. I had him in graduate school as a professor. And I also became certified as one of his immunity to change facilitators, because so many people were asking for that workshop and they didn't have enough people to do them. So I used that very structure to interview teachers and administrators and parents all around the world as I've been traveling with international schools and with U.S. independent schools and with very high achieving public schools here in the States. So I just want to tell you how the good news is the adults have been incredibly earnest in responding to these very difficult questions. Once I recruited the adults to the realization and asked them, I would always ask, make a list of the symptoms of the kids who are struggling most in your school. And everywhere I went, the symptoms were the same ones that you would do too. Kids who are anxious and depressed and stressed out in all kinds of ways, but also kids who were suffering from eating disorders, or kids who were cutting themselves, or kids who were in fact suicidal. So I would say, well, those are kind of like complaints that we have about kids in our schools. We're concerned about kids like that. So that's when I started to use the immunity to change paradigm, and I just followed it exactly the way Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy designed it. So I'm just going to read a few statements from what people have said. I asked them first, in light of these conditions and these concerns that you have about students in your school, let's find out what it is that you as a school or you as an individual are actually committed to. What has you concerned about these kids in the first place? And so the question was, respond to the following statement, I am, or we as a school are, committed to the value or the importance of blank. And I'm just give you 4 things that, from a sample of hundreds of responses. We are committed to challenging our students to intellectual and personal growth with an appropriate level of rigor. We are committed to educating our students in healthy and safe and balanced ways. We are committed to promoting a healthy school culture, and we are committed to the health and well-being of our students. And when everybody finishes that part of the interview, they all feel great because they've just identified, part of their life mission. And then I ask them, again, according to this paradigm, what are you actually doing? What's in light of this commitment you have to health and wellness and balance, what are you actually doing in your schools that's getting in the way of that commitment that you've just articulated? And once again, they earnestly admit, they say we overschedule our students. We overfocus on the college admissions process. We assign way too much homework. We place too much emphasis on grades, directly and indirectly. We expect our students to think like adults and to act like adults before they actually are adults. In fact, we actively promote a developmentally unhealthy culture. So at that point in the interview, they're not feeling so great at all. They're now feeling a bit low. And actually, things get a little worse before they get a little bit better. Because then I ask another question, which is this. Imagine yourselves doing the opposite of the things you just admitted to. If you didn't overschedule your students, if you didn't assign all that work, if you didn't overfocus on the college process, if you didn't expect your students to act and think like adults before they actually are adults, what would come up for you? What fears, what anxieties would come up for you? And what everybody admitted to was this. I'm just going to read a few. If we didn't overschedule and assign too much work, then we would be seen as having lost our standards and lacking in rigor and excellence. If we didn't do all that overscheduling and so on, then we would be perceived as intellectually soft. If we didn't, there are 2 that just really kill me, and here they come. One is, this is from a senior administrator of one of New England's most prestigious boarding schools. This guy said, if we didn't overschedule and so on, then our reason for being would cease to exist. The value of our diploma would plummet, and no one would want to attend a school with such low academic standards. And finally, from another senior administrator from a New England school said this, listen to this language, if we actually gave in and a developmentally reasonable schedule emerged, it might achieve a healthy balance for our students at the cost of our own school's distinctiveness. We might lose our edge of excellence and become a vanilla school. And who would want to come to a vanilla school? So at the same time that these adults are open and honest about their being committed to wanting to educate their students in healthy and safe and balanced ways, they also are beginning to recognize that they themselves are in a bind. And the bind is that while they want to educate their students in healthy and safe and balanced ways, they also want to maintain their status as an elite school. They want to protect their brand. They want to please their parents. They want to keep their jobs, and so on. And so this creates the massive bind. This was the heart, really, of what At What Cost was about, because it means that this is a book that was written about students, but for adults. This is about adult development. It's not about taking care of students. It is about taking care of students, but it's about changing the way we as adults operate in schools. So with that, what I've been trying to do is think about, I actually had a project. NAIS has sponsored a project for a partner and me to be doing this research over a 2-year project, 2-year status with one school here in the US, who had committed to us to try to make the kind of adaptive changes that we had suggested, and we were going to guide them through their process. We couldn't tell them what changes they had to make, but we were going to supervise and counsel and consult to their process of changing. And we were doing that, and that it was going really well, but slowly and deliberately. And then suddenly this little deadly virus shows up on the planet, and everybody almost overnight makes massive massive changes. Every school in the world has had to make changes immediately to try to maintain the safety of their students, to maintain the safety of themselves. Um, this crisis has forced a kind of global change in schooling. All of us now have been exposed to the last 7 or 8 months of schools that are operating in ways that 9 months ago we could never have imagined them operating, whether it's by fully remote or by any one of a number of hundreds of versions of hybrid schooling that people are doing. That tells us that change is actually possible. It was really quite striking to me. So in one of the questions that David had posed to me, you see, I have it here. How has COVID-19 sharpened the focus of schools on these themes of student well-being? My honest response is, I don't think they have yet. I think they are in an ultimately reactive defensive mode because they have to be. They're not thinking so much about the more subtle developmental needs of their students. They're just trying to make sure they can get their students an education in the best way possible, and that just keeps fluctuating. And then one of the other questions David asked was, how has distance learning made it easier or more difficult for students? And I think my answer immediately is, it's done both. It's certainly come at quite a cost, but adolescents everywhere are getting much more sleep than they ever did. Adolescents everywhere don't have schedules like they used to have, that were hectic and that were kind of weighing them down. Adolescents are spending much more time with their families in ways that are meaningful and helpful, but at significant cost. It's also hurt them. It's hurt them because they have been deprived of what they need most, which is the physical presence of each other. Adolescents define themselves by being in the company of each other. They try on different identities by interacting with each other. And you can't do that by Zoom. That's a real natural process that happens at lunch. It happens during the transitions between classrooms. It happens in the classrooms itself. So they have lost a very significant part of what is developmentally most necessary for them. So finally, as people, David asked, as people in this field of admissions and in these schools, I watched a talk about 3 months ago that Bob Keegan had given. And one of the things that was striking about it was his bringing up the fact that as difficult and as challenging and as anxiety producing as this whole COVID pandemic has been, there's actually some enormous human potential happening here, that everybody on the planet is focused on the same thing. And by this time, everyone in schools has been doing school in ways that they never could have imagined. I have already begun to imagine what school might actually look like when we go back. I think it would be a shame if, when the COVID pandemic is over, as it dwindles, if we went back to just the same old normal. We've already learned too much about how to use technology effectively, about how to connect with each other in all kinds of ways. I think there's enormous human potential that this crisis is going to lead to in how we ultimately evolve into how we do education. So I'm going to stop there. I hope I've given you something to think about, and I'm eager to hear what your responses are.
David, thank you. I think there's a lot. If you haven't read the book and this is the first time you've heard David speak, I think you would agree that there's a lot of questions there that we might want to take into our groups. One of the things, David, that we've been looking at, and some of us in admissions have been thinking about a lot, I think, is the way in which the current crisis is shifting what parents want and the priorities that parents have for their children. And in terms of that hierarchy of needs, there are some things that are being pushed, albeit temporarily, perhaps up the agenda, and there are some things that stay the same.
One of the things that's impressed me here is I've seen some schools who decided over the summer to go into this current school year fully remote again for the safety and well-being of everybody concerned. And the parents of associated with those schools practically revolted, wanting their kids to go back to school more than anything else. Even at the cost of risking their safety. Many other schools have done all kinds of versions, as you know, but it was striking to see, and some of those schools that I've been following have in fact tried to go open in gradual ways, just temporarily, because Thanksgiving is going to come here in about a month, and by then they're going to close again. So anyway, I think parents are wanting. They want what they used to have, which was a safe and healthy, balanced education for their kids in quality schools like yours. And they can't have that right now. And the whole system is out of balance. And that puts everybody, no one knows how this is going to end up. We don't know. We just don't know. But I hope that when we do go back to whatever that is, that going back reflects the fact that we have a true appreciation for the developing status of our students. Their brains are still young and developing and developing. Before the pandemic, they were young and developing, and it's not as if they become adults suddenly because of this pandemic. They are still needy, and they still need us, and we, the adults, still have to be in charge and be the adults that take care of our kids in developmentally healthy and safe and balanced ways, in whatever way that looks in the future.
And I think one of the things that you've alluded to, David, and is certainly very clear in your book, is that, and I think we see this a lot as in meeting families on a regular basis, that every parent, and those of us who would be our parents, would say of ourselves that we all want the best for our children.
Yeah.
And probably we know inside somewhere what those things that are good for our children and those things that are detrimental. And so this is not a gap in knowledge, it's actually a gap, you might call a knowing doing gap. We know what kids need, we know what is healthy for them and not, and yet somehow our structures are pushing us to do those things that we know are in some ways counterproductive.
Correct.
And how you've worked with a lot of schools around the world, a lot of international schools. Yeah. Can you give us some examples of things that maybe are changing, or some signs of hope that people are adapting their systems and the educational programs?
Well, I don't have anything very concrete, but the ones I have worked with, I've had this conversation with lots of people in lots of schools to say, wow, imagine the way that we're using technology now is amazing. Teachers all around the world have had to learn what to do and how to maintain, a sense of class continuity by Zoom and by all these ways. They have come up with all kinds of ways to do things differently that they never would have imagined they could have done before. So I don't have anything specific and concrete other than the fact that schedules might be different. Technology use and use of remote, access might be different. Access to international communities might be different. It might be much easier to have schools in the States and schools in Europe or schools all over have projects where they're working together and have this just be a normal part of what becoming an international school and becoming a citizen of the world actually means. And I think that a lot of what's happening now is laying the groundwork for some tremendous progress. But I think that progress is still months. I'm not saying it will happen, but I think there's tremendous potential that it could happen. And that's certainly going to be my press. One last thing, the other last thing that has my attention significantly is that, you know, on the other side of the admissions work that you guys are doing is the admissions work of the college community. And so much has changed there too. And now things that were once, they were crazy. We were already in somewhat of a sick world with respect to that process, but they've gotten crazier. And now, because of the pandemic and because so many kids have taken gap years instead of going to college this year, the entire landscape for how to get into college is changing. Most of the colleges have become test optional. So there's so much that's now new and different and unfamiliar. What it's doing is creating a greater sense of anxiety among parents who wanted their kids to go to Harvard, or who wanted their kids to go to wherever it would be. And now there's no clear roadmap for how they're actually going to do that. So it's increasing the anxiety of the parents, not decreasing that.
Well, David, I was intrigued. I was mentioning to the group about, in one of your recent blogs, you were talking about how this pandemic relates to Kubler-Ross's stages of, you know, of grief. And, but of course that ends with a real death that has to take place before that goes on. But it still seems that there's a lot of denial going on amongst our parents, that we're not willing to put, or at least to accept, the death of an old system. Instead, we kind of have it on life support, hoping that once this pandemic is gone, we can go back to quote unquote normal. So I think that until we actually are willing to put a stake in the heart of the old system, we're just going to return to that same way of thinking. Somehow there's a death that has to take place that we're still not accepting.
I think it's happening. I think you're exactly right, Alec. And it's happening, and it's painful. And yet it's that kind of painfulness that will lead to, I think, has the potential to lead to some kind of growth, to some kind of, while the groups were going on, you know, one part of the book that I didn't talk about, which is in a sense the second part that's equally important about, because when I get to this point in a talk, people always say, well, then what do we do? How do we fix this? And the answer is there's no easy answer. And I go into a long discussion, you might remember, about the difference between technical and adaptive changes. And technical changes are those changes that we already know how to do these things. You know, if you need, the examples I use in the book is, if you need, you know, surgery, you hire a surgeon who knows what to do and how to get you out of the problem. And there's a very technical, it's not trivial at all. We've all experienced the experience of, you know, flying from one place to another. And that's a technical challenge, if you will. We trust that the technician, the pilot, is going to get us from point A to point B, and it requires nothing of us that we sit there and just hopefully land safely. But adaptive changes are challenges for which the answers don't yet exist. So David, when you were asking earlier on, what should we be doing? You know, my thinking is that is exactly what your admissions team and other admissions teams around the world should be thinking about together. And I don't have a technical response to that, other than the fact that the wonder and the awe of true adaptive change is that people generate ideas together, they struggle together, they work together, and then they try some things. And some things work and some things don't. And over time, what I've done is draw, can you see this little design I've done here? There's a circle with a big line down the middle. And this section over here kind of reflects what we already know, about a certain situation. But if I were to, and this line reflects our assumption about things, and this open space that doesn't have anything in it reflects where we have to go, what we still have ahead of us to learn. So if I did this, I'm sorry for being so, just if I drew that line and just those arrows reflect steps that we might generate together, that we might think about together, that might be willing to risk taking new things together. Some of those steps might not work. Some of those things might work really well. But over time, let's just say that those steps work really well. What we've essentially done is expand the way we know something. We're now seeing things in a wider, bigger way than we previously had imagined. And that kind of growth process only happens when people come together, think together, work together, struggle together, and take chances together on new ways of knowing, new ways of working, and getting feedback from each other. This is a long-term process. There's no technical response to how do we get out of this, particularly since we're all still in it and have no way of knowing when it will be over.
Yeah, David, I think that the world has gotten used to this kind of notion of instant gratification, quick answers.
Yeah.
And you know, the big game changer could or would be a vaccine.
Yeah.
Because if a vaccine is developed and made, you know, available,
Yeah.
then things could all go back to the way we've always done it, maybe with a few changes. But the thing is that we don't know yet about
That's
that
right.
vaccine. What drives me a bit crazy is when I hear my colleagues talking about things the way we did it last year, and I'm going, it's not relevant. I don't want to hear about this because it's not the answer for now. But
No.
they haven't sort of disconnected. And you know what? Maybe they won't have to disconnect because maybe in 6 months there'll be a vaccine and we can all go back to the way we used to do it.
Yeah.
But I think it's this issue we have that we want to know right away what the answer is.
Yeah.
And I think I think when I looked at your two lines and then I saw the one in the middle, I thought, well, that's the limbo.
That's
We're
right.
in the limbo
Mhm.
right now.
It is limbo.
And
Limbo means that we try new things. What schools
Yeah.
around the world have been doing is trying new things, trying new ways to operate. Faculty meetings have been filled with, how do we do this? What ideas what are new ideas? How, people have been making adaptive changes in schools all around the world. Doing things.
but I thought you were saying they're still reactive.
They are, and
So
they're
reactive to me is like, how do we survive this rather than what are we going to do to improve it going forward, or how is this going to be the new normal thing? You know,
Yeah.
it's like putting a patch on it.
I would say that those two things are not mutually exclusive.
No,
there
they're not.
There has to have been a reaction because they have to do what they have to do. But
Yeah.
but part of their reactivity is leading to new ways of knowing that they never could have imagined.
Mhm.
And that means there's tremendous potential for growth. That if a
Yeah.
vaccine did suddenly show up, first of all, it would take a long time before all of us could get it. But my hope is that the world begins to recognize that we've all been through sort of the same thing together. And we don't want to go back to just the way things were. We have the potential to change things for the better, for our students, for ourselves, and so on.
I think part of it is just the language as well, because you've used the word growth and change.
Yeah.
And growth can lead to change, but I think people like hearing the word growth. The word change still freaks some people out.
Change is hard, yeah, but growth is change.
Yeah.
You know, it's hard to grow up, and sometimes our own growth patterns are themselves painful. We hit crises along the way that set us back, but those kinds of crises, as painful as they sometimes are, lead us to new ways of operating and lead us to new ways of knowing, and that's what growth is. That's what development is. It's all kind of, it's all kind of the same, I think.
Maybe, David, I have a kind of question that I'm left with as we draw things to a close this evening, and that is, I think of myself and when I went to school and the kind of traditional education that I had, which was that kind of you tried to do everything you could to fit into any school day, and you had to make sure that your educational career was an accumulation of like Boy Scout badges in the hope of getting to the next level of the game of life. And I think as parents, we've started, and as educators, we've started to kind of move a little bit further. And we know that that's not the way to do things. How hopeful are you that, as we look at our current students and maybe our own children, that this is a change that will occur in, if not our lifetime, but in their lifetime? Do you see that there can be this seismic shift, this radical movement to a new way of doing and being school that has got these things sorted? Or is it too soon to say?
First of all, I'm as hopeful can be. That I just can't believe that, the fact that 7 billion people on the planet focused on trying to work on the same thing, get a vaccine and go back to living kind of normally, won't lead to something that's filled with change and with growth. But we have no idea. We just have no idea of how that will work. I wish I could look into a crystal ball and say it's all going to work out just like this. But I really do think, you might remember from the very beginning of my book, I quote Margaret Mead as having said, never doubt that a small group of people can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that's ever done that. And I think that the international schools and the independent schools are resourceful enough, not just financially, but cognitively and from ideas perspective, to be able to begin to make the kinds of changes that they maybe wanted to, but they couldn't do before, or changes that are continuations of things they have already been doing for the last 7 or 8 months, or perhaps all the way through this year. There might be ways to tailor some of those changes into more permanent ways of understanding that education doesn't have to be as linear as we perhaps experienced it, that there's so much more to learn and new ways to learn all about that. I'm incredibly hopeful that is the case. But, I don't have a magic wand.